Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Kevis, and thank you for tuning in to my presentation. Today's topic is on gender-neutral language, a case study for universal adaptation. Before we get too far into it, a little bit about myself. My name is Richard Kevis. I currently reside in Brampton, Ontario. A little bit about my backstory. I was born with motor dysgraphia, a neurological condition that made it very hard for me to translate my thoughts to written word. But despite this disability, I've dreamt of becoming a full-time writer, and during the COVID-19 lockdown, I successfully self-published my first novel, The Waltz of Blades. After rekindling my passion for writing, I enrolled in Sheridan College as a student of the GASU program. I'm also a 5th edition Dungeon Master, to whomever that may be relevant towards. Alright, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of it. So the question is why? Why did I decide to do the topic on genderized language? Well, when I was writing my novel, and I put it through my first editor, a simple question arose on the second or third sentence of my book. Why did I use the term mankind instead of humankind? Well, in my brain, the phrase mankind was more evocative of a fantasy story. A statement, it sounded more dated, but ironically that's part of the problem. If my editor didn't point it out to me, I would never have actually been able to see my own bias in the story. My choice of words created an immediate visual image. Mankind causes people to think man, male. And if you just go the history of mankind, the mental image it gives you is just of that, men. And at first I fought back a bit about that's just a petty concern, petty complaint, doesn't really take away the story. But part of the problem here is by my word choice at that moment, I had actually self-sabotaged my own story, and I decided the effort was worth it to go through my story and remove any of the dated language, unspecific terms, because I wanted to hold myself to a better standard so my work could stand on its own and be about the story, not the choice of words. And if I can put in the effort to make the small changes required to make my own story less inclusive, then quite frankly anyone should be able to apply this. So, before I go into it, I'm giving the scope of this presentation. Despite the fact that many of these topics about our development of the English language, our choice of words, the innate inclusion and exclusion, lead to a big history of gender inequality, I am not focusing on that in my speech. I am acknowledging that gender inequality is a big factor in many of the linguistic choices available to us and why we use them. However, this is a topic that I could do an entire presentation about on its own, and just for the purposes of this essay, I want to acknowledge it, but not dwell too much on it. I want to focus on the use of the language itself, rules, syntax, and semantics that can be applied to make language clearer and more accessible for everybody. Genderized language has changed in academic writing over the last 50 years. And the thing is, our language is evolving. If we go back far enough, including the early 1990s, the term the term non-binary reached popular usage. And as our identities evolve, our language needs to evolve to keep up with this. There's discrimination in many forms when it comes to language, including race, ethnicity, age, and I'm focusing on genderized language particularly as a case study, but many linguistic rules could be applied to allow clearer communication across all spectrums. So, for today's speech, I am focusing primarily on gender. So, Before I go in, I'm going to bring in some of my personal biases. When I started writing my own book, as I elaborated earlier, you always have to wonder when it comes to linguistics, what rules are necessary? What measures are already in place? And is the world moving in this direction? How are the rules in the past and how are the rules in the present? So as I went through my research and development, I looked into what the rules were, what they are currently in academia, what they were in various aspects, and what they could be. So, to the research question itself, why should the use of gender-neutral language be universally adapted? I'm going to have to break down my research question into a few points before continuing on. First, what do I mean by gender-neutral language? I mean specifically not using a default as he or she, only using the terms he or she when they apply, and using terms for non-binary individuals such as they, their, and exploring some potential new terms that could be included in the vernacular. Language is more than just words. Language is not only how we communicate, but how we write down, codify, and structure rules of society. When I say universal, I mean using the language guidelines popularized by things such as Chicago and APA, looking at APA in particular, and how these rules could be applied to many aspects in our life. I want to take a look at where we're heading towards, where do we need to go for society to communicate clearly, and my thesis itself. Data has shown a direct correlation between the language used and various levels of discrimination. Everything from job hiring to legal rulings can be affected by the language used. There's lots of opposition to the adaptation of using bias-free language because it could be claimed to be an attack on free speech. However, it is necessary to remove outdated elements from our dictation to allow bias from all political sides fair exposure. You want it to be about what you say, not the way you say it. For information needs to be exchanged without the innate bias being worded into it for us to clearly communicate with each other. Gender-neutral language needs to be adopted universally, as you'll see as I go through this presentation. First, we're going to look at the big three aspects of language. First, we're going to look at education. It is how we learn. It is where it's typically the highest quality of these guidelines. Then we're going to look into legislation, which is the rules we're all required legally to follow. And then in conclusion, we're going to take a look at corporations and how they can express their views fairly. So first, in education. When I looked into the APA Style Guide from 1977, it became very clear that they recommended you still follow gender-neutral terms and apply to gender where it lives. But it was written and codified that linguistic clarity was take priority over genderized language. It was that if you needed to say he or she to make it sound smoother than attempting to use they, you are to use the he or she even though they didn't advise it. When we move to the rules of 2020, it is much more codified and specific. Entire chapters in the APA, American Psychological Association Style Guide, are on the topic of language, bias-free language, and codified rules of how to use it. A big factor is on the level of precision. To describe something in the most abstract term you can to be scientifically accurate. Don't say man if you're talking about people. And try and use the level of precision that matches what you're talking about. Another key aspect in the modern coded rules is humanization. Not using an adjective to describe a person, but instead using the adjective followed by people. You want to describe as people, not as a group. The labels we give are very important to how people view the term and can drastically change one's opinion simply by phrasing alone. Next, we move into legislation. Many countries around the world, including the United States and Australia, have a person defined as he. Legislation is free to use the term he, and it is common knowledge that it is a person. In Australia, however, with the change of laws and a lack of legal language for non-binary usage, I have found research to show that they're running into issues where their laws are not accurately being applied to the individuals because they do not have the legal vernacular they need to get their points across. However, in Sweden, they've taken to creating a new set of pronouns that are truly gender neutral to allow the writing to flow smoothly without having to resort to the archaic usage of he and she. Another thing worth noting in legislation is biological sex is different than gender. Gender is legally considered an identity, whereas sex is your biological state. We do need to increase those terms because sex is not simply binary. This has been proven, as has gender. And many forms of legislation can result in discrimination. If your terms are not clearly defined, then it becomes hard to legislate and act around the existence of people if you're not considering all genders to be people. Moving on to the third topic, we head into corporations. Corporations, as I did my research through various case studies on job hiring, will specifically use language to direct people of the gender they wish into the roles they think are more suited to the gender. Equal opportunities are legally required, but through use of clever manipulation of language and terms, it becomes completely possible to no longer provide equal opportunities based on the genderization of the language. And in various studies I've seen and read over in my full report, it has become apparent that even if you're in a vacuum in a computer setting run digitally, if you use your words to indicate gender, it can result in how people receive and acquire information. Targeted language is being specifically used to affect the genders of the people being employed by these businesses. If you want to give fair and even information and reporting, you have to make sure to follow the standards and language practices to give everyone equal opportunity. To move into counter-arguments against the use of implementing non-genderized language worldwide, first is the notion of enforceability. Is it going to become illegal? Will it be slander if you use the wrong term, the wrong genders? What level of enforceability is required? Another counterpoint is the notion of free speech. If people's ideas are being interrupted when they're speaking simply because they use the wrong choice of words, are you in fact taking away their right to speech? There's various language barriers that could come into effect, meaning that universalizing non-genderized speech will have drastic issues between different language. And many people and traditional works of writing may become outdated or invalidated by new modern standards. And lastly, if we head back to the APA style guide from the early 70s, we do learn that they did want to prioritize academic clarity, making sure you say things correct, instead of making sure you say things with the correct words. However, despite all these counterpoints, the various studies and research have shown empirically that by not using a codified rule of genderized information exchange on those three main areas will result in discrimination, biased hiring reports, legal uncertainties, and the denial of humanity among those groups. But moving forward, I still have much work to do on this topic myself. I need to do research into the exact codification. What policies should be legal, what should be just common practice, and how to make it from a style guide used in academia to a style guide used in all aspects of communication. I would love to find more case studies and data to prove empirically that switching to a system where genderized language is only used when specifically speaking about those genders and the groups between causes positive ramifications. I have to look into what would be justifiable legal ramifications for not following these policies. And lastly, looking into different countries that are implementing new words to the vernacular and new policies in reporting and legislation, and the positive effects they've had. As our language evolves, our rules need to evolve with it. What constitutes offense and what constitutes correct policy need to be in check. Here is my bibliography of my various sources and research that I've used for this presentation. Thank you all for listening, and have yourself a lovely afternoon. Take care, and goodbye.